Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is the Research Working Group on Disaster-Related Volunteering. My name is Lori Foster, and I manage the group on behalf of IAVE. Great to have you all with us today. The Research Working Group on Disaster-Related Volunteering started several years ago at the initiation of Mr. Ed Martinez, head of the UPS Foundation. He worked with IAVE to get this group going to help other companies learn how to best respond to disasters with their resources, in particular, their human resources. And we have been meeting for several years, trying to understand best practices and opportunities for volunteers in disasters, and also how to best partner with leading NGOs in disaster response. And the purpose of today's webinar is to learn more about all of those issues. And one of the key questions that we always encounter is how to respond and when to respond to various humanitarian and natural disasters. So we are very fortunate to have two experts with us today. Cameron Burge, who is Humanitarian Response Manager of Microsoft. Cameron was previously at the UN, within the UN system, in UN operations, and also with the World Food Program. And he's got lots of experience in disaster response. And he's going to talk first about how Microsoft responds to humanitarian disasters. And following Cameron, we're going to have Frank Schott, who is VP of Global Programs at NetHope. And Frank has been in senior roles at NetHope for the past 15 years. So we have lots and lots of experience with us today. So we're going to first hear from Cameron, and there'll be a chance for you to ask questions, either by electronically raising your hand or by using the question box. And then Frank will share information about NetHope with us, and we'll ask Frank questions and then engage them both in any questions from the audience. So let's get started. We're going to start, as I said, with Cameron, and let's go.
Great. Are you able to hear me, Lori?
I can, yes, perfectly.
Great. Thank you, everybody. My name is Cameron Burge. I am the Humanitarian Response Manager at Microsoft Philanthropies. So my role is to manage how Microsoft provides resources to external organizations during sudden onset humanitarian disasters. And then internally being that single focal point of truth for how the company is responding. I sit, as it mentions, I sit with Philanthropies on the Tech for Social Impact team. The Tech for Social Impact team is actually relatively new, and Philanthropies itself is actually only 2 years old as a business unit. The TSI team manages all the nonprofit relationships with regards to sales and then also donations. Philanthropies is, for those who are on the call, is actually a business unit within Microsoft, and so we're not a foundation. So we're actually able to operate in a very flexible manner, which is quite nice. So in this presentation, I'll be explaining sort of how we manage our humanitarian response, and then taking any questions that you might have with how we operate. So going into our humanitarian approach, builds upon our existing corporate philosophy of empowering organizations and people. So this is very important about the empowering element of it. As the humanitarian response manager, yes, I do ensure that resources are provided. At the same time, it's also managing expectations within the company and staff and managers about what we're doing and our capacity to do so. I'll get more detail on that a bit later. However, the key thing is that Microsoft is not a first response agency. We merely provide assistance to those who are. And so that is the key foundation on which we're constructed and how we organize ourselves. It also has an impact on how we deploy staff to provide assistance, and then how we raise awareness messaging on how staff can assist. There's probably The largest challenge we have in the beginning of any disaster is having people understand that there are experts out there and expert agencies who are better prepared to be initial responders. So where does this sit in the company? So we have three basic types of disasters or emergencies which can take place. We have an internal emergency. So this can be, say, a product that Microsoft makes all of a sudden doesn't work one day. That has quite a dramatic impact on our customers and our organization. And that is handled under the incident management team structure. This structure is supervised by global security, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But they are the ones who spin up at different and varying levels, depend on the scope and the size of the emergency which has taken place. We also have customer or government emergencies that can take place. These can be where a local customer or a local government agency has declared their own internal emergency and require emergency technical assistance. We have a services disaster response team that manages that. They're able to provide free technical resources. And as an organization, we tap into quite heavily during our disaster response. And they're also the largest impact that we have. I'll get more details there. And then we have our humanitarian response, which is what we manage. All of these can happen independently. We definitely have humanitarian emergencies that we will manage and address. At the same time, they can overlap. And Hurricane Maria this past fall would be a classic example of where everybody's engaged and then mutually supporting all of each other's activities. It's very important in this area for people to understand is that during emergencies, there are limitations to our role. So examples being staff safety and staff support. That very much happens under the IMT structure. So to give you a look at that, and this is sort of how it comes together here. We are part of the IMT structure. We do feed into it. We do participate in the trainings as our staff around the world and ensure that we are represented. And our major role in any IMT structure is to ensure that people in the meetings understand how and why we would be providing resources to other organizations such as nonprofits. Now, again, in this structure, there's very much an emergency where we're not brought in, and that is completely understandable. And again, that there will be situations where we are activated and the IMT is not activated because nothing has taken place that actually adversely impacts our staff or our business continuity. It's modeled very much after sort of the FEMA IMT system, and it has been a formalized structure that's come together the past 2 years. There's also quite a number of rehearsals that take place within the company. We also run our own rehearsals, generally in the desktop form for the BTeam that comprises the humanitarian response mechanism. So once an incident has happened, what do we do? So I call together the BTeam that I manage across the company through various business units that would have the ability to provide resources. And we sit down, and what we're going to look at is the severity and the relevancy of an emergency, and then that is going to determine our response level. Severity is just what it sounds like. Severity is the impact on the people, the impact on the society, how many have been affected, what is the scope and the nature of the damage. Whereas relevancy is going to be our ability to actually positively respond to the emergency, and this will vary. Where we have large office presence, that will increase the relevancy. If our staff have actually been affected and are part of the emergency, then that definitely increases the relevancy. And there are areas of the world that we just have very little presence and very little ability to impact the situation on the ground. And so that will lower the relevancy score even if it has a higher severity. And between the two, we do come up with a measure that determines whether it's a local, moderate, major, or maximum response. And these different categorizations determine the amount of resources that will be made available from the company. And I'll get here, there's a slide coming up that'll talk about the full impact of the resources. But once we have that categorization, it will determine where the lead sits for driving our response and how it will be managed. So all maximum and major categorized emergencies will be managed by myself and the team here in Redmond, which is our headquarters. Now, globally, we do have Philanthropy Leads and what we call our A14 region. So within Microsoft, we have the world broken up into 14 key markets. Some are individual countries, such as Japan would be an example, while others are an overall geographical scope, such as the Middle East and Africa. And they all have a regional lead that's part of Philanthropies. And within each country or market, we can also have field leads. These field leads are managing other programs that we have, such as our education programs, any other sort of resourcing that we do in the area. And for a lot of people, these will be part-time positions they have, not full-time. So local and moderate responses where there will not be a lot of resources coming out of Redmond will be managed at that level with guidance and supervision coming from myself and our philanthropies team. Our regional leads are quite strong and are very much and live in those areas that they're responsible for and are very familiar with how those areas operate. And we generally defer to them on decision making. And also when it comes to the question of which agencies we're going to support, we very much rely on their assessment and their knowledge of a region. To give an example, if we're operating in a country that we have not operated in before, we're going to have our own prioritizations on how and who we support from a nonprofit level. We very much prefer organizations that we have a relationship with in the past, we've worked with, have been part of our structure, and we trust their ability to deploy the projects that they mentioned, if they happen not to be a global organization where we already have an established relationship here in the Redmond area. Now, the BTeam that comes together for the resourcing does cross quite a bit of the company. So we have various communications groups that come together to help manage messaging. This is the management of both of our external messaging and our internal messaging. We have different elements such as the language lab, which is able to rapidly use machine translation for a language that has not previously been translated before, to areas such as Skype, which can provide free activation, and elsewhere throughout and other elements throughout the company. Our largest value add, though, is the one I mentioned earlier, which is our MSDR teams. So these are teams of engineers that are able to provide emergency technical support for customers, government agencies, or nonprofits who have found their own internal systems either overwhelmed and requiring repair, or not able to handle the situation that's taking place on the ground. A good example of what we call an MSDR mission was in the, I believe, it was the Ecuador floods, where there was a government agency responsible for their disaster management, and their own website just did not have the capacity to handle the new traffic. They were just too overwhelmed. And so we very quickly did a lift and shift onto a cloud system so that they can scale and get back moving again. And I'll talk a few more about some of our missions and our overall responses here in the next couple of slides. But for the group here, actually, I think I want to pause and explain this a bit more. So we as a company do not send volunteers, staff volunteers to disaster with a Microsoft hat on. What we do though is provide Microsoft staff and their expertise and skill set. And what Services here has done, which is quite valuable, is so they have a bucket of man hours, of funds that they have access to. So when they scale up and they need talent from across the company, and most of the missions actually work remotely with different skill sets wherever we can find it in the world, the team's able to turn to their managers and get staff released to support these projects without having a negative financial impact on that local team's P&L sheet. So instead of the hours being, hours have to be accounted for against either a customer or a particular project, these hours for engineers can now be accounted for by the services disaster team. And that's where they've been able to scale fast and really bring in employees quite quickly. Managers are willing to release them at that point to know that it's not going to have a truly adverse impact on their own operations. And again, it's the highest value add that we have as Microsoft when providing assistance. For myself, I do have the ability to provide some limited cash grants. We do have our software grants, and we do have our Azure grants, which is our cloud system. But our real value add is going to be our MSDR response mechanism. In Q1, and actually I'll go ahead and bring up the next slide. You can see the value that we provided as a company for the major and maximum responses that took place. And the largest value were these services disaster teams. For Maria, they just closed about last week. The last mission finally wrapped up. But they had, I believe, the final count, 18 different missions supporting nonprofits and government agencies across Puerto Rico took place. And so it's really going to be how we're able to drive impact the highest. And again, and the staff do get engaged. And we get comments all the time that as far as their experience as Microsoft employees, it can be their highest impact and most memorable activity that they do. They get very excited. We were able to draw on some incredible skills and really throw them at significant problems. So seeing the breakdown here, this is Q1. Now, we've been fortunate since Q1. We've had no what we would call major or maximum events that have taken place. And for those in the call, I also want to sort of raise awareness on that categorization. So there are unfortunate events that take place around the world, and we are aware of those. Our ability as philanthropies to contribute is going to be quite limited, and we do distinguish between humanitarian emergencies and humanitarian tragedies. And a tragedy is truly unfortunate. However, with an emergency is where you find a government or society's ability to respond has been compromised. Whereas in a tragedy, it has not. And so we can help with messaging, we can provide help with assistance, we can help local offices if they wish to provide resources, how to do so with the appropriate corporate accounting and techniques that are required. It's just we're not going to essentially do the resourcing on our end. And in addition to the resourcing of the service disaster missions, I'd say the other high impact that we do have is around our staff giving. So one of the things we do is raise awareness among our staff about how we're getting involved and how they can use, especially for the American staff, how they can use our local giving portal to donate to causes and get matched by corporate funds. Now that employee giving already exists and is always there, but we're able to highlight it a bit more using internal messaging to help drive awareness and donations. And so for the Hurricane Maria response, staff giving plus corporate match was around 1.4 million, I do believe. So the next slide just sort of highlights some examples of resources that we're able to provide as a company. For the United Nations and Hurricane Maria, we were able to use an MSDR mission, which scaled up quite quickly and did a very ad hoc application on building damage assessments for the island nations of Barbuda and Dominica. UNDP was able to deploy with some donated tablets, quickly assess the damage to structures that took place around the countries. This is training local staff, and all that data came in through for us, a Power BI, which is a BI visualization tool dashboard that can drill down and map and overlay the scope of the damage and do different assessments. So the government agencies could understand the scope of the damage that took place. We assisted with mapping, again through Power BI, for some of the damage aggregator tools that took place with the agency supporting the government of Puerto Rico. And then TD Whitespace, which is a connectivity support tool. We were able to donate equipment and some engineering support for it. And actually, NetHope and Frank will discuss how they aggregate the resources from companies like ourselves for a response. And that's a key thing I want people to understand is it's great that Frank is on the phone because we do rely on agencies like NetHope to really drive the response. And we want to provide support to organizations such as themselves. And it's where we try to really channel our resources through such organizations because we believe they'll be more appropriately deployed and truly have the expertise for the need assessment that we're just not able to do on our own. And then internally, We have quite a few tools that have taken place. We have an internal dashboard that all staff have access to, that they're able to see our all-up giving. They can drill down into the different responses and see how we respond. We have an automated alert system for those who sign up. I've generated a response playbook. We're in version 2 of it now, and this actually feeds, this is on the same format as the overall Microsoft response structure. So it feeds into that and is sort of like one of the categories of the corporate response. And then we have a training, a webinar that I've done for staff. And all philanthropy staff are required to take it, and then it's encouraged for anybody else that may be involved with philanthropies or on the BTeam, which I pulled together. And so those tools all exist internally to help standardize and help drive awareness and how we operate. And so at this time, that is my brief. Anybody have any questions or would like me to clarify any of the areas that I've covered? Please let me know.
Thanks, Cameron. That was terrific. I mean, you have a lot of great practices because what I hear from a lot of companies is that their employees want to know what their company's doing, how they're responding, and you've got a very nice organized system. You also mentioned that your employees are not volunteers per se, but the V team are people who do their regular daytime job, but it appears to me they're also on call for disasters for you. And if that's the case, how are they selected to be part of that team? Could you address that?
Certainly. And so one of the things I did when I first arrived was a bit of a landscape analysis, determining who had been involved in the past, which teams have been trying to provide resources to emergencies, and then bringing them all together. And so we engage on a regular basis and run. If we haven't had an emergency, we'll run a tabletop rehearsal about once every 6 months, where I will conduct a simulated emergency, and we'll have a call and discuss how we'll respond, and does everybody have access to the right tools, really test our systems out.
Oh, excellent. And what sort of people agree to be part of the V team? I mean, is there a profile, would you say, of employees that are part of that? I mean, they all have all different skills, but do you see any common denominator in those who are involved?
Not necessarily, because it's at the end of the day, it is supporting another business unit within Microsoft. And so it basically is going to that unit and being like, you guys are involved in philanthropic response. I would like to have a representative from your team join us. And almost everybody's excited to join. The managers are like, yep, we understand we need to remain engaged. And so I'll get somebody with that responsibility. But at the end of the day, it's very similar to how they would support any other business unit.
Okay. So it sounds like you have a very organized system in place. What's next for you? What is your next challenge?
That is a great question. I mean, from the disaster response side, it's actually just really sort of keeping our skills sharp and staying rehearsed, staying part of the overall response system. I mean, we're going to participate in the FEMA national exercise, remain engaged in a lot of those areas. And I think probably the next direction, though, will be we have the ability to engage in projects before disasters and increasing the strength of nonprofits and their capacity beforehand. And I think it's projects along that we're going to start really being developed in a more professional way.
Excellent. So while the others are thinking about their questions, maybe we can tee up Frank's slides and talk a bit about NetHope and what they're about and what they do.
Thanks, Lori. Sound check, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Good. Well, let's go to the next slide. I'm really happy to kind of share our story with everyone today. For those of you who don't know much about NetHope, NetHope's a 17-year-old nonprofit consortium of all the large humanitarian organizations. So our members are, the logos you see here on the screen, CARE, World Vision, Red Cross, Catholic Relief Services, altogether, well, now 57 international NGO members. And our mission statement is, we empower committed organizations to change the world through the power of technology. And our members are certainly one key aspect of that committed organizations who want to use technology to improve the human condition. Let's go to the next slide. There's another set of maybe next slide. There's another set of committed organizations that are part of the NetHope ecosystem, and we call them NetHope partners. And these are mostly the leading technology companies, but there's some others. And these are organizations that support NetHope and NetHope member programs in a variety of different ways. There's cash grants, there's expertise, and then there's product. And we'll talk a little bit about our disaster response work, which represents about 30% of what we do. And like many of our member organizations, it's probably what we're best known for, in part because that's when the spotlight is on, and the world and CNN and others are paying attention. But emergency response is super important to what we do, and the support that we get, again, in mostly cash and expertise or volunteers from our corporate partners is essential to our surge capacity. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just a sample of the emergencies that we've responded to over, say, the last 5 or 6 years. We actually, the first major response was in 2004 during the tsunami in Southeast Asia. And this was a case where NetHope members came together and said, hey, look, we're working together, we're responding to the same emergencies, and now we have some real challenges with restoring communications capabilities for our offices in Southeast Asia. NetHope could aggregate those needs and work with our corporate partners to help address them. And that for years has been kind of the core value add of what we do in emergencies, is really trying to understand in those first days following the emergencies to what extent the emergency responding organizations have the communications capabilities that they need in order to respond. And we have kind of coined the phrase, communications is the lifeline for emergency response. You can't get food, water, shelter to where you need, where it needs to go without, certainly not at scale, without communications capabilities. And if you think about it, we had roughly, I think, 30 member organizations in Southeast Asia during the tsunami. We had roughly 25 member organizations responding to the Ebola outbreak. In Hurricanes Maria and Irma, probably 15 to 20 organizations. It wouldn't make sense for those organizations on their own to go establish or reestablish communications capabilities. And so having an organization like NetHope with our partners bring equipment in, bring people in, and then help get the responding organizations connected makes a lot of sense. So our kind of roots are in restoring communications capabilities, but now the kind of the second emerging trend is something we call information as aid, or communicating with communities. And this is something that is kind of a growing trend in international development. And at its core, it says that communities themselves, if they're connected and if they're provided with useful information, they can kind of self-help which will reduce the pressures on the humanitarian organizations, or maybe stated another way, will accelerate the ability of the communities to recover from whatever the emergency was. And so in the Ebola crisis, we piped in bandwidth to many of the more rural communities so that emergency response organizations and the Ministry of Health could provide useful information to those communities. In the Syrian refugee crisis, we established Wi-Fi hotspots, 87 of them along the migration route, Wi-Fi hotspots and charging stations, so that refugees, as they were migrating north to Europe, could access information resources provided by two of our members, IRC and Mercy Corps, that would help them in that kind of safe journey. And of course, if they were connected to these information portals, that also meant that they were probably connected to family and friends, which provided some of the psychosocial benefits that are inevitable when you're involved in that kind of a stressful situation. In Puerto Rico, we used the Facebook platform to essentially reach out to communities that we had connected in, Puerto Ricans who were coming back online with news you can use. So just some fast facts about Puerto Rico. We established communications capabilities and power solutions for 85 emergency response organizations. Only 4 or 5 of them were NetHope members, but most of them were targeted by the government of Puerto Rico, and where they asked us to go help these organizations. We provided community Wi-Fi hotspots to 27 of the most vulnerable communities in Puerto Rico. And altogether, we estimate that along with our support for mobile network operators, we were able to bring 750,000 people back online. And through our Facebook page, we reached 1.5 million unique users on that Facebook Information's Aid page. So maybe a third aspect of our work, and Cameron touched on this, is throughout in the hours and days and weeks following a response, we're getting all sorts of inputs from our member organizations and other emergency response organizations. And we think one of our big value adds, certainly to our corporate supporters, is being able to provide that kind of aggregated view of where the greatest needs are. That's perhaps one value add. The second is that when we decide that we're going to ship resources into the theater, we do it in bulk, and then if we have to break bulk when we get there, we'll do that. So in Haiti, after the earthquake, we had our member organizations were having a hard time getting in the kind of computing equipment that they needed to support the increased rosters that they had. So NetHope, along with some of our corporate supporters, Microsoft and Dell and HP, essentially did 2 bulk shipments into, in this case, Dominican Republic, and drove it over to Port-au-Prince, where we essentially did the break bulk and provided those computers to, I think, roughly 15 or 20 organizations. So that's another part of our value add. Let's go to the next slide. So we've got, we out of the experience in the Caribbean, we've did a learning workshop middle of January to kind of assess what worked and what didn't work. And we had representatives from Facebook and Microsoft and the Emergency Response, Save the Children, Cisco, and we all got together. It was roughly 40 of us to talk about what worked and didn't work in the Caribbean. And one of the big takeaways was that not only is the Caribbean not building back better, but they're probably not going to be at a build back to where they were at this time going into the last hurricane season. So you have communities that are much more vulnerable to the next hurricane season than they were a year ago. And so we began architecting a Caribbean disaster preparedness plan, and that we're in full swing on that. We still have outstanding funding appeals for that work that we'd love to share with you. But there's really kind of three pillars to this work. One is the people side, and I'll come back to that in a second. The other is equipment. We're pre-positioning equipment in a UN warehouse in Panama right now, and the information side. So gathering information in advance and kind of having a more established playbook about information flows and where we're gonna get information from and who we're gonna provide information to across the entire Caribbean is a big challenge, because one, we don't know where the hurricanes will hit. We have kind of different nation states, different languages, but a big part of our preparedness is on the information side. On the people side, we have kind of two types of teams. We have the rapid response team, and this is a group of people that can be in the theater within 24 to 48 hours of an emergency. And this is kind of our Green Beret team of people that we deploy, and I'll touch a bit more on the profile of those people in a second. We then have our our response roster, which is a standby roster of roughly 200 people, again from a mix from our member organizations as well as our corporate partners. And these are people who we have trained, who will go into the theater, but usually not in the first 2 weeks. Usually it's after week 2. And these are people who go in for usually a 2-week rotation, and then they come out. Most of the people on the rapid response team, those kind of Green Berets, are in there for longer, but the standby roster is usually 2-week rotations. Let's go to the next slide. So as I said, we've got kind of two types of two sources for our response teams. On the rapid response side, we have the NetHope staff, many of whom are first on the ground. We have Cisco TAC Ops, who have been responding with us for years. And they have a special part of a carved out department inside of Cisco that helps both their corporate customers as well as their partners like NetHope with engineers who can deploy in 48 hours. Same is true for Ericsson Response. And then the last group is one that probably hardly anybody's heard of. It's called ISAR, which is the Icelandic Search and Rescue Team. And if you think about it, they probably respond to in the most austere conditions possible when they're doing search and rescue, and they've proven to be massively useful in as first responders for us. So they all have ready to go bags and often are there with us first on the ground, and we actually still have some ISAR people in Puerto Rico right now. On the standby roster side, we have representatives from Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Team Rubicon and Save the Children. And these are all people that again, we've pre-qualified. They're ready to go for 2-week stints. The way it works is we will call up the people on the roster that we need, depending on what their skill set is. They'll check to see if their manager says they can free up for 2 weeks. If yes, then we make arrangements for them to come work with us. If no, we move on to the next person on the roster and kind of fill that way. In Puerto Rico, at one point in time, we had 5 Airbnb homes with roughly, I think, 25 or 30 people from NetHope Cisco, Ericsson, Facebook, Google, all mixed together, and all kind of working on behalf of NetHope and for the response organizations. So let's go to the next slide. So in terms of the roster skill sets that we need, in the olden days, I guess 7, 8 years ago, we were mostly looking for networking people, but increasingly as the scope of our work has expanded, we place a premium on some other skill sets. Certainly anybody who can do any kind of multitasking and coordination is massively useful. In Puerto Rico, I think we shipped in something like 15 tons of equipment, and it doesn't all come in on one plane. It comes in bit by bit over the first couple of months. And so being able to just handle the logistics around that is a job or two. But then the overall coordination of the work on the ground, there's a lot of moving parts, especially when you have people coming and going with two-week stints. There's just a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And then there's a lot of communication that happens with the both internally and externally. And we found that when the engineers are out in the field all day doing the work, they come back at the end of the day. It might be 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. The last thing the engineers want to do is write up an email saying, here's what we need. Having seen some of those late night emails back in the olden days, we finally said, let's put somebody in place who's an internal comms person. And actually we've been able to source some of those from Facebook and Google, marketing communications people essentially, who are great communicators, written communicators, and they've been able to help quite a bit in terms of getting communications internally, but then also externally in terms of helping us tell the story on the ground, because I think putting a human face on the work that we do as we're doing it is important. So with that, I'll wrap. As I said, we do have a Caribbean disaster preparedness appeal out, and we'd love to chat with any of you about it. And we'd love to explore employee volunteering opportunities. We are doing we have 2 4-day trainings in Panama in mid-July for selected corporate volunteers. I will say one more thing. We typically will not just, if we're going to do a volunteering program with an organization, it's almost always the case that that organization is also helping with cash funding for some of our programming. We have only so many organizations we can support with a volunteer program, and we have way more people raising their hands at some of our existing corporate partners than we can put on the roster. And I would say, the type of person we look for, I kind of shared with you some of the skill sets, but we also prioritize people who are, let's call it, emotionally rugged and can work in austere situations. Our team in Puerto Rico, those Airbnb houses didn't have power for the first 3 months. So, the cold running water gets old after a while, and no electricity gets old after a while, and the 14-hour days gets old after a while. But having people being able to kind of handle the austere conditions, and then having people being able to handle some of the tragedy that you see, some of the adversity that you see is important. And so oftentimes when we go do screening at our partner organizations, we look for people who have ex-military experience, because usually that would suggest some level of emotional ruggedness. And you'd be surprised at how many diamonds in the rough there are that have had amazing careers before they went to work for our corporate partners, and are particularly well suited for this kind of work. So, so with that, I will leave it there and turn it back to you, Lori.
Thank you, Frank. That was also an excellent presentation. Really good view on how you respond. And I'm curious because I think collaboration is the next great challenge in this space. And you have really done it with a number of organizations, a number of companies. Can you share your secret of getting so many organizations to collaborate? How do you do it?
Well, I think there's a few things. Normally in an emergency, organizations kind of drop their competitiveness and they just do what's needed. And so that's obviously something that is a built-in advantage. I also think none of our corporate partners think that they by themselves can be the only organization that responds. And so the fact that we're part of a collective is particularly attractive to them, because it kind of offloads, kind of the investment and kind of ensures greater scale and impact. We, as a rule for all of our programs, whether it's emergency or not, really value connecting with our corporate partners at a more strategic level, especially with their expertise. And I think from our standpoint, a lot of nonprofits kind of like to hold the private sector at arm's length. We're exactly the opposite. We wrap our arms around and don't let go. And that's in part because the type of expertise that you'll see at a Microsoft or a Cisco or an Ericsson is way greater than NetHope itself could ever have on its own, and way greater than our member organizations could have on its own, is way greater than the government of Puerto Rico could have on its own. So partnering deeply with the talented people, whether it's on the telecommunications side or on the logistics side or on the comm side, or communication side, is part of it. And I think we do build up, kind of a certain part of our way of working is working with corporate partners, and it's an essential to what we do.
Excellent. Well, kudos to you for that. You mentioned that one of your other value adds is to get an aggregate view of the greatest needs in a disaster and then disperse that to the companies. Can you tell me just briefly how you do that? How do you get the information out?
Yeah, depending on who the partner is, but we are kind of broad reach communication goes via webinars. And so whether you're a NetHope supporter or not, or teleconferences, whether you're a NetHope supporter or not, if we have you on our mailing list, we will invite you to a teleconference to give you the latest update from Puerto Rico from our side. And
okay.
And so those will happen as frequently as we think a latest update is useful. Basically when we have new information, and that information essentially is an aggregation of the feedback that we've received from our member organizations, the feedback that we've received from our teams on the ground, and the feedback from other reliable sources, OCHA and others. And so, but then with some of our closer corporate partners like Microsoft and Cisco, our door is always open virtually, and so we'll have calls throughout the day, between teleconferences saying, here's what we're hearing, here's what we're hearing. And oftentimes they'll call us and they say, hey, we just got a request for this. Are you hearing anything else like that? Because again, we'd don't mind helping this one organization, but we'd like to do something that's with a bigger scale and impact. And if we're going to ship in this amount of stuff, we'd like to maybe go bigger if it would really make a difference.
Excellent, because information is the key in disasters, and I know when something happens, everyone's trying to assess. So I think should members get in touch with you to get on that mailing list?
Yeah, so you'll see my email there. I'll forward it to someone on our team. I'll say another thing that's kind of an emerging trend is data. So our corporate partners have data that can be used to support our emergency response efforts. And one very easy example is in Puerto Rico, Facebook was able to tell us or visualize for us, here's our users on the island who were online before the hurricane, and here's the areas that are dark right now. And we got that view updated almost daily for the first 3 months from Facebook. And so that enabled us to target our efforts with mobile network operators to go bring communities back online. And we did lots of overlays of kind of vulnerability and that sort of thing. And so that's one example of getting data from that could actually help in support of a response effort. So kudos to the Facebook Disaster Maps team for that.
Excellent, excellent. And I've got one last question for you, Frank. What are you doing in Syria right now?
We are not doing anything in Syria because of the insecurity in Syria.
Okay.
But we're doing. We still have roughly. We're doing a lot of work around the Syrian refugee crisis in the 6 or so neighboring countries. We're starting to shift from pure connectivity work to tech-enabled refugee education. And as you probably know, in the region, there's a real challenge in the education systems. And some people are framing it as a refugee education challenge, and it is, but it's also a challenge for the host governments, because the host governments have schools that are filled to the brim, half days with refugee children, half days with host government children. And what that means is that a whole generation of children in that region, whether they're refugees or not, are only going to school half days. And so we, along with some of our tech partners, again, Microsoft has been a big supporter of this, are doing work around trying to implement tech-enabled education programs to take a little bit of the pressure off the schools and off of the lack of teachers to help children that way. And so that's a kind of part of our effort today, since the refugee migration has largely stopped.
Excellent, excellent. So you're very diversified there. Well, I thank you, Frank, and thank you also to Cameron for excellent, excellent examples and lots of good information. We really appreciate it. And I will share with all the working group members, those who are on the call today and those who could not, because we did record this session, the slides and the contact information for both you and Cameron. And I'll just pause and see if either of you have any closing comments, anything you'd like to add. Happy to hear from you.
Nothing on my side, Lori. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or want to know more specifics about how we operate. Always happy to share.
Great.
Yeah, I hope this is just the start of a conversation. So by all means, get in touch with either Cameron or me, and we'll try to do the best to help you understand where your organizations can add the most value.
Excellent. Thank you both to our presenters and to our listeners. And we will continue to talk about this subject. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.